One tip Good evening, everyone, and very great welcome to you all, and thank you for coming out on Friday night. At least it's not raining, it's a nice, pleasant evening. I'm Beth Davies, and I am the ex-president of the National Union of Teachers, and I'll be chairing this question time this evening. But before we start, I introduce you to our panel. I just say a few housekeeping things. We have mobile phones off. Photographs allowed. John can't take a mobile phones or whatever. And if there is a fire drill, because there are things going on in the school tonight, we have to go through that door and then congregate around the building at that end on the outside of the building. That's just to get housekeeping issues over. Well, I'm delighted to say we've got our panellists, apart from one who was, I think, coming, John. The MD for Gloucester. To my left, can I introduce you to Jeremy Hilton, who is the parliamentary candidate for the Liberal Democrats, Richard Ford, who is the parliamentary candidate for the UKIP, Jonathan Ingleby on the end, who is the parliamentary candidate for the Green Party, Sophy Gardner, who is the Labour Party parliamentary candidate, and of course our own General Secretary, re-elected for the second time, we're delighted to say, Christine Blower. I'm going to call your name, and if you don't have the question in front of you, I'm happy to read the question out for you. If you have the question on you, then I would like if you would stand and ask the question of the panel. And we're going to start with Judith Norman. Yes. Yes, Judith? Do you want to ask your question, please, to the panel?
I'm Governor of the primary school. Have been for 37 years. I would like to know what any of us, government, parents, anyone can do to stop the micromanaging of schools and to let the professionals get on with their job.
Thank you very much, Judith. I'm going to start with Jonathan, the Green Party.
Stand up, please.
Yes, please, would you like to?
Well, I was talking to somebody just the other day now. This is not primary schools, but it's secondary. And they have recently moved from the state sector, if you like to call it that, to the private sector. Here in Gloucester, I'm not going to mention the names of the institutions because that would be invidious, I think. And I said to him, what's the difference? And he said, well, we've got more space. We're not, to use your phrase, micromanaged. We're trusted and we're allowed to get on with the job without huge amounts of supervision and so on. And all I can say is, you have my sympathies. I think we've got to cultivate greater trust in the whole educational setup so that we are not constantly on the shoulders of our teachers saying, you will do it this way, and particularly if the directives come from a distance, that's even worse because they don't know what they're talking about. So, my sympathies. No solutions, but I'm with you all the way.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to go to Sophy Gardner. Sophy, asking to be micromanaged.
Thanks for the question, Judith. I'll keep it fairly short and sweet. Tristram Hunt, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, has said on the record several times that he thinks what the education system as a whole needs at the moment is a bit of stability and less change and turmoil. And in particular, he said that there should be no prescribed system of teaching and that schools should be allowed to get on with doing the job they know best, which is, I think, the point you're making. So I'm very happy and comfortable to say that that is a statement on record by, hopefully, our Secretary of State for Education, and I agree with him.
Thank you very much. Well, you asked what you can do to stop micromanagement. What you can do is to vote UKIP, because UKIP believes in devolving power locally in the form of referenda, in the form of local decision making. You're the local governor, local parents, local people they are the people who are involved in the running of the school, not something like the Secretary of State. UKIP very much believes in localism, and we will devolve power back to the parents, back to the governors, back to the local people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Jeremy.
Well, as a Liberal Democrat, I've always believed that it's up to the governing body to run the schools, and it's not the job of the state to micromanage any of the public assets. It's best to leave it at a local level. I think that's probably the case anyway. I think most schools are, I know the school in my area, that the chairman of the governors is here, does an excellent job because it's got a very good head teacher and it's got a very good chairman, even though he's a member of an opposition party. I know he does a very good job at that. And so I don't think schools are being micromanaged. I think the important thing is that we don't see change for change's sake. And I know that the Liberal Democrats want to make sure that we just have a core curriculum, to make sure that youngsters can read and write, and then leave it up to the schools to develop their own curriculums to widen that, so make sure that children get the education that they personally need. I know that it's important that you really help young kids to develop as they learn. I know when I was at school, I was never a great writer of English, but I could learn things quite easily by looking at pictures and diagrams and drawings, and I think it's important that schools just develop kids in that way. One of the great innovations of the coalition government has been the pupil premium. That's one of the four big things that we have on the front of our manifesto. There's now £1,200 going into that. Now, my view is that if that had been introduced by a Labour government, there would have been a lot of instructions on how that money was going to be spent. It's entirely up to the schools how they spend the £1,200 that they get for the pupil premium for any disadvantaged child in their school. And at the moment, there's a £12 million extra that's going in to schools right across Gloucestershire. And there's catch-up classes, there's a lot of one-to-one teaching. It's all about the schools deciding what's best for those children that they're taking on. So I don't think the premise that you made that the state is micromanaging schools is actually the case. But we've got to make sure that any future government doesn't start poking its nose into the way schools are operating. I mean, you've got to have Ofsted to check the schools are running okay, but you've got to leave it to the governing body and the head teacher to run the school the best way they can.
Thanks, Jeremy. And finally, Christine.
Thank you very much. Well, there is, of course, an incredible irony in this, isn't there? That one of the things that the DFE would tell you when Michael Gove was the Secretary of State was that they were devolving all this power down to schools through the Academies programme. But in fact, who was managing the Academies? Well, actually, it was the people in the DFE in sanctuary buildings. So it's completely cutting out any sense of localism, any sense of local oversight, ownership, possibility of intervention, or whatever. And if your child goes to a school that's an academy school, it isn't a local school in that sense, because actually if you're a parent and you want to complain beyond the level of the school, then there is no one to whom you can complain. You can only complain to, well, now Nicky Morgan or one of her officials. So in the guise of talking about localism, in fact, what you've got is an incredible level of micromanagement. Now, if we are talking about the 37 years over which you've been a governor, that's roughly the length of time that I've been a teacher. I started teaching in 1973. And there have been swings and roundabouts. And the thing is, when I first started teaching, it's true that for the most part, local authorities did run schools. We had a minimum staffing establishment, they told you which staff you had to have, and so on and so on. The days of that are long gone. Decisions are essentially taken at school level. But I have to say, we in the National Union of Teachers feel the loss of local authorities very deeply. We don't agree with all local authorities. We're not politically affiliated, incidentally, I should say. We're not politically affiliated. But we don't necessarily agree with what all local authorities do. But we actually think that that is the right framework in which schools should operate, and that way you can get the kind of what politicians always talk about in terms of support and challenge in order to make sure that schools are on a trajectory to improve. And just because we're very keen in the National Union of Teachers on evidence-based, evidence-informed policy, I would say to you that in terms of trusting the profession, which jurisdiction is it in Europe that has the most successful schooling? Well, it's Finland. And Finland does trust its teachers. It has no external accountability arrangements. It doesn't have school inspection. I'm not even saying we shouldn't have school inspection, but I am saying that we need to balance that accountability regime with trusting teachers. And finally, I would say that actually the micromanagement that happens in schools is not just what I was describing with the DFE. It's not just accountability. It's also the fear of the oppressive regime that is Ofsted. And actually, very much of what Ofsted does is absolutely not leading to school improvement. If you doubt that, because I tell you we're an evidence-based organisation, then you just have to read what Robert Coe, who's Professor of Education at Durham, says. He says there is no evidence that £157 million spent a year by Ofsted and has been spent every year since it's created. There's no evidence to show that the existence of Ofsted, has created school improvement. There is no evidence to show that. And in fact, so widespread is the fear of Ofsted that even this government decided that they had to put out a mythbuster about what Ofsted actually expects and what people believe it expects. And I have to tell you that when that poster and that information appeared in schools, some head teachers and senior leaders in schools have been so oppressed by the Ofsted regime that they actually thought that this piece of paper that clearly said that it came from the DFE was actually a hoax, probably a hoax perpetrated by the National Union of Teachers. But I can assure you it wasn't. It was actually an attempt to say that there are some things that get about that Ofsted thinks that they want, that actually they don't want. Micromanagement is not the way to operate schools. It's actually leaving it, as you say, to trust teachers and governors, and indeed the wider community, but under the auspices of a properly run and properly resourced local authority. And finally, let me say on the curriculum, we've seen just recently that in Wales, where they've been working on the curriculum, Graham Donaldson, who's done a lot of work on the curriculum in Scotland, has just done a report saying that actually what we need is a framework curriculum. So in Wales, just across the border, we will be finding our teachers trusted to develop the curriculum, to do it collaboratively within their schools and across different schools. And that is the way that we will get real improvement. Because those of you who know anything about the London Challenge, where schools were given a little bit of money but actually worked together, London went from being the least well-performing region in England to the best performing region in England by trusting teachers to get on with it. So I'm very pleased for the job that governors do. They're not well enough trained, I'm bound to say, in lots of places, but actually that's what we should be doing, leaving schools to do the things that they should do, having local authorities to resort to do the things that they should do, and leaving politicians in sanctuary buildings to do a significantly amount less than they do now.
Thanks. Come to the next question, and this comes from Jeff Davies. Is Jeff here?
Yeah.
Jeff, do you want to...
If I can find it. Sorry, bear with me. Okay. Academies and free schools in England are allowed to employ unqualified staff to teach. I'm sure that none of the panel sat up there now would want an unqualified surgeon to operate on them. Just as parents don't want unqualified teachers to work with their children. Teaching is a profession just like medicine. What are the parliamentary candidates' views on this issue, please?
Thank you, Jeff. Sophy, Labour Party's view on unqualified teachers.
The Labour Party's view on unqualified teachers is that they shouldn't be in our schools, and just as you said, they shouldn't be teaching our children, just as I really wouldn't want to be operated on by an unqualified surgeon, I can assure you of that. Just in 1 year to last year, there was a 16% rise in the number of unqualified teachers in our schools, directly as a result of the freedoms that have been imposed is perhaps the one way of talking about freedoms, but the ability of schools to employ unqualified teachers in free schools and academies. And I think that's really worrying that that is such a large rise. I have spoken to a teacher, funny enough, somebody who's ex-military, because there's this big thing about it's brilliant to have lots of military people teaching. Well, actually, I didn't. For those of you who don't know, I was in the Royal Air Force for 19 years. I didn't learn how to teach people in the Royal Air Force. I learned how to run an airfield. And if I wanted to be a teacher, I think I should be qualified to teach, not just because I've got some kind of military background to be able to do it. But that person told me that they went into the school and they were teaching the following week without any training at all. Now, they were supported, but I find that really very scary. So we will legislate to make sure that you cannot have unqualified teachers or teachers who are not undergoing training in schools. There's no ifs, no buts. I better not say that, have I? Because it's got bad connotations, but I mean it.
Thank you. And now can I welcome Victoria meeting, which is the Conservative Party MP for Gloucester. Richard, would you like to answer that question? Unqualified teachers in the classroom?
Yes, of course. And firstly, apologies for being a few minutes late, partly because I was navigating badly around the wrong side of the school, and partly because I was on the telephone to a constituent with a pretty serious collection of family problems. So apologies for holding you up. On the specific question, I think we all agree that the vast majority of teachers should have QTS. No question of that. And the figure at the moment is that just under 97% of teachers do have QTS. So the question really is whether we as a society, we as a nation, are prepared to allow head teachers the chance, if they want to, of hiring outstanding linguists, engineers or scientists, for example, to come in and bring their special expertise in order to come and inspire young generations of people who might want to enter those professions later on. And I think our philosophy is very much that actually, yes, we do want to allow heads those freedoms. They should be allowed the freedom to choose. And it's interesting actually that the Shadow Education Secretary, who is not QTS, has done some teaching in schools himself and was taught at a school where almost all, if not all, his teachers did not have QTS. So it doesn't seem to have done him a great deal of damage. I think we should allow heads the freedoms to find the best teachers. The vast majority of those should and will be people with QTS. Do we want to exclude the possibility that there are great teachers out there who don't have that qualification? I think we should leave that open.
Thank you. Christine?
Well, again, on the basis of evidence base, we did ask parents, and we got a response that said 82% believe that publicly funded schools should only employ qualified teachers. That's quite a hefty majority, better than probably most people who sit in the House of Commons. My figures are different from yours, Richard. My figures are that there are 13% of the current teaching force who are unqualified. So that doesn't rate to 97% being qualified, does it? But we won't abandon statistics. But it's perfectly clear that if a school wants to have someone come in who is an engineer or who is a fluent speaker of Mandarin, there are all sorts of ways in which, if you want them to come in and inspire somebody, that you can do that. I go into schools and I talk about being a trade unionist and the importance of trade unions, and I happen to be a qualified teacher, but I go in and talk about that. And I'm very keen that people from the world of work should be in schools talking about that, not, I might say, just secondary schools, but actually primary schools as well. But being an extraordinarily good linguist or an extraordinarily good engineer is not the same as having the pedagogical skills to make sure that you convey that to a group of young people. So that's where the difference is. We actually believe that teaching is a proper profession for which you should have a professional training, you should have qualified teacher status, and that should be the entry to the profession. So of course, have other people come in, by all means. And then the other question, of course, that the NUT gets asked, since that is our policy, and I guess since it's a Labour Party policy, apparently they might be asked this. The next question is, well, would you sack these 13% of people who are currently operating in academies and free schools? And the answer is no. We would put them on a route to gain qualified teacher status. Now, at the moment, there's a a multiplicity of routes into teaching. I personally happen to believe that the best route is still to do a PGCE in a university where you have the opportunity to spend a lot of time in school, but also do reflection and work with professors of education and so on. But we all know that Michael Gove thought that was the blob, so clearly he didn't think that was the best thing to do. But there are a multiplicity of ways in, and therefore, if we were going to make sure that all teachers were qualified, that's what we would do. We would say that those 13% of people in the teaching force at the moment should get onto a route to get qualified teacher status. And if I wanted to go back to Finland, I would say not only are all Finnish teachers qualified pedagogically, they're also all at master's level before they even go into the classroom. So if anything, we would want to look to having teachers that were effectively more highly qualified, but relevantly qualified in education rather than less qualified.
Thank you, Christine. Jonathan, what is the Green Party's view of
Green Party would agree with everything which has just been said, and I don't want to say it all over again. We are 100% in favour of qualified teachers in the classroom, and I would just like to, and I am going to say it again, I would just like to reiterate that experts are welcome in schools, of course they are, and maybe an inspiration, but that doesn't make them expert teachers. So, same point. I agree.
Jeremy?
I wanted to pick up a point that Sophie made about not having qualified medical staff treating you, when in fact a lot of medical staff are under training, and they might not be fully qualified at the time when they're looking after you, but they're under guidance from people that are qualified. So having people in a position where their training is important, and people need to be trained in a teaching environment. However, the Liberal Democrats believe that teachers will have to have QTS, or they have to be training to get QTS to be teaching in schools, and that free schools and academies will not be allowed to employ teachers that aren't fully qualified by 2016. So I think it's important that we see a school environment